The human butt has long been a source of our joy, sadness, amusement, self-consciousness, judgment, and lust. All of these emotions are especially in play for the female butt. But why did we evolve to have a more pronounced backside than our primate ancestors? Why did the modern objectification of the female butt begin a little bit more than 200 years ago? And what forms has that ideal butt taken since then? We discuss these things and more with essayist, journalist, and Radiolab editor and reporter Heather Radke, based on her new book, Butts, A Backstory. Heather, thank you so much for the time. How you doing today?
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm good. I'm good.
It's my pleasure. I really like to start these author conversations by asking what your goal was with this book. And oftentimes with a book, that may be fairly obvious based on the title or subtitle, but I think it's an especially important question to ask you based on Butts, A Backstory, not really giving people a whole lot of detail on what this book entails. So what exactly was your goal with Butts?
Oh man, what a question. It's such a hard question to answer because, as you write a book, it took me 5 years or something to write this book. And it obviously, to some extent, you have an idea of what it's going to be at the beginning, and then it changes as you go. And I mean, I think maybe my goal was to have people think about butts and bodies in a new and complicated way, and to maybe think a little bit harder about a part of ourselves that is kind of easily dismissed or kind of easily laughed at. And that's not to say, I always say this because it's not to say that the book isn't like fun or that there's not fun parts of the book, but that I wanted to kind of offer something that would allow us to kind of explore something that we maybe just take for granted, or we don't take that seriously. And in part as a provocation to say, what else might we not take so seriously that might be kind of full of stories and interesting, important, histories that have gone underexplored.
Well, I think much like the butt in general can elicit so many different positive and negative emotions. I think this book doesn't necessarily elicit negative emotions, but a lot of insight to go with the occasional chuckle too. As a matter of fact, I think it was in the intro that I learned a new term that I'm going to have you explain to the people now. What exactly is a gluteal cleft?
I mean, it's a butt crack, I think, is what it is. I one of the things I talk about in the introduction is, we kind of don't have like a correct word for this part of our body. Like, for example, breasts, we know breasts are the right words, even though we often call them something else, boobs or whatever. But with butts, we don't really have a correct right word. And I actually went and talked to a few doctors, or just, casually. It wasn't that deep of a reporting journey on that particular part. But I asked a few doctors who are like colorectal surgeons, people who like have to talk about butts, what they call it. And one of them called it a gluteal cleft, but that's actually just the butt crack. So it's not the whole thing. But other doctors mostly call it like, butt or tush or whatever. They also use the euphemisms.
And while you take a special interest in the female butt, and we'll certainly get into that, you also look at the evolution of the butt and why humans do have a more pronounced backside than not just our primate ancestors, but also pretty much every other creature in the animal kingdom. Why exactly is this, Heather?
We are, in fact, the only animals that have butts, at least in the way that we mean the word butt. Obviously, like lots of animals have like a joint where their leg meets their torso, essentially. But the muscles that make up the butt, so the gluteus maximus and a couple of other ones, are uniquely human, and they evolved basically to help us run. There's a scientist named Daniel Lieberman who did a lot of work that some people are actually already familiar with because it was pretty popular in the early 2000s, where he discovered that one of the most important kind of evolutionary adaptations were a set of adaptations that allowed early humans, early hominids, to be able to run. Because if you can run, you can actually hunt big animals like antelope and kudu and these kind of big four-legged creatures that can run really fast, but they can't run really fast for a really long time. But humans have this kind of extremely good endurance capability because of a set of adaptations that include like your Achilles tendon and the way that your like, like the way we sweat and the, I'm trying to think of a few other ones, like even like the runner's high, people think is part of this set of adaptations. But one of the adaptations is your butt, because it helps you to basically not fall forward when you're running. So that's why we have butts. And it's also like, there's no other creature that can run quite in this way. And so we're the only ones who do have butts, but that's of course only the muscle part of the butt. There's also like other parts of the butt that I'm sure we'll talk about.
Oh, yeah. And I love that you got to visit with Dan Lieberman. He's actually a former guest on this show, and his book Exercise, which came out a couple years ago, is literally one of my all-time favorites. So that was cool. You also got into Big Frida, another former guest on this show. We may talk about twerking a little bit later on. You spoke with another scientist by the name of Jamie Bartlett of the University of Colorado, who actually considers the human butt a Swiss Army knife. Why is this Jamie Bartlett's belief?
I first met Dan Lieberman when I was working on a story for Radiolab, where he suggested that we go to this kind of famous race in Arizona where humans run against horses. Like it's like human v horse. I mean, it's called the Man Against Horse race. It's pretty straightforwardly titled, and humans win. So it's like a sort of, you can really see his theory in action there, and he'd run the race. And when that story came out, Jamie Bartlett wrote me and was like, although butts are for running, probably, they also are probably for like a lot of other things. And so like a Swiss Army knife, they're used in many different ways for many different kinds of motion in the body. So jumping, climbing, she said to me, like, when you look at a track team, the people with the biggest butts aren't actually the long distance runners. It's like the pole vaulters or the long jumpers or something. And so her point was like, while it did help us run, it probably also helped us with all these other things when we were in the early days of hominid evolution. And that just shows the kind of multiple ways that the butt is used and was used as part of our evolutionary journey.
And speaking of evolution, animals and really all living organisms, they evolve typically for survival, to protect themselves at times from potential prey, in part by blending in with their environment. But how are male peacocks an exception to this? And does this challenge the belief that women's butts are more pronounced than men's, specifically for the sake of childbirth?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complicated question. And it's one that's been complicated for as long, since Darwin, basically. So Darwin kind of famously says, like, the peacock, like, I forget the exact quote, but basically the peacock kind of drove him crazy because it's such, as evolutionary biologists say, it's such an expensive adaptation to have this sort of extremely big, really visible tail that the peacock has to drag around. It's like heavy, it's almost heavier than the body. It's like a huge ordeal, right? So like, what is the evolutionary purpose this could possibly serve? And the peacock is this ultimate example of sexual selection rather than the kind of survival of the fittest mode of evolution. It's about attracting mates, and it's part of what evolutionary biologists called ornaments and armaments. So like other things in this category are like horns on like a deer or a stag or whatever. So, and so that there's evolutionary pressure to basically be attractive to your mates. And this, we sort of see this clearly in the peacock tail. But there's a question about whether the female butt is one of these adaptations. And evolutionary psychologists really believed that sexual selection was driving the way that female bodies looked. This was like a very popular theory in the 90s, and that they were always kind of reaching for these evolutionary like explanations for why bodies look the way they do, which don't actually have a evolutionary biologists basically disagreed with them. So the question, there was this kind of theory that you'll see in a lot of popular magazines, which is that women's butts are big or fatty or whatever, or men find women's butts attractive because they are symbols of fertility, because essentially the woman's butt that's big, has more fat on it, is what they call an honest signal of sexual potency, or like the ability to carry more children. And there's no evidence of that at all, and there's really not that much evidence that that it is demonstrative of anything at all, except for just like the wide variety of human variation. So I was really interested in that question, and kind of why it became like, why that is such a tempting thing for us all to believe, because it's not the only evolutionary psychology thing that's like very popular, but it is one I hear a lot because I've been writing a book about buns for 5 years. And, I talked to a bunch of scientists about it, and they're just like, there's basically no reason to think that. And while it could be true, it also very much could not be true. And there's really almost no way to prove it. So I think one of the things to sort of take away from that is just this idea that it can be really tempting to look for scientific evolutionary explanations when there really aren't any, because it helps us to justify some idea we have about ourselves or about the world. And it's a kind of way to close off inquiry instead of to kind of open it up. So yeah, so like, do men like women with big butts because they're more fertile? Probably not. And also, like, not all men like women with big butts. And also, like, there's all of these many other explanations for where our metaphoric and symbolic ideas about butts come from. And that's basically the rest of the book, is me exploring those ideas.
Yeah, I thought it was a great explanation that you gave, and it really did transition nicely into a more specific look at the modern objectification of the female butt, which shockingly for me goes back more than 200 years. An obsession with butts took over in London, England in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So much so, and this may cause some people to cringe here, that there were literal fart clubs where people would get together and drink different juices to find out what kinds of sounds and smells they produce. That just makes me shudder to think about. Although my kids loved that factoid. It can be argued that it was around this time, a little more than 200 years ago, that the modern objectification of the female butt began with someone by the name of Sarah Baartman. Now, I know this story has become much more well-known over the last 20 plus years now, but who exactly is Sarah Baartman for those who are unfamiliar, and why is she so important to this story?
Yeah, so Sarah Baartman was an indigenous South African woman who was brought up to London in the early 1800s by two men who displayed her as a freak show in London because she had a big butt. And they sort of used her as a symbol of these kind of racist ideas about Black women that were, had been around for about a century, but they were really kind of gearing up and getting more potent at this time. And the story of Sarah Baartman was one of the reasons why, like, they basically used her as a way to, create and codify these stereotypes. So she was displayed in London lots and lots of people came and saw her. It was a very popular show. There was eventually a trial, which is one of the ways that we know a lot more about Sarah Baartman than we might have, because at that time there was a lot of angst in London about slavery, and there was some fear that she was actually enslaved. And so there was a trial to sort of figure that out. The determination of the trial was that she was not enslaved, although that still is contested by scholars today. And eventually she ended up in Paris, where she died very young. And her body was dissected by a really famous scientist named George Cuvier, who used the autopsy report as a way to, basically reinscribe and create, documentation for the stereotype of the big butted African woman as a hypersexual specimen. So he was really invested in an idea that African people were less human than European people. And he used this autopsy report as evidence for that, but then also for evidence that she was, because of her butt, she was a more sort of sexually potent and sexually, hypersexual person than white women. And then he displayed her body parts of her body in his museum, where they stayed on display until the 1980s. So into both of our lifetimes, I assume. And, it's a really intense and kind of grotesque story in a lot of ways. But I think it really shows us clearly how ideas about race and gender are just so deeply and powerfully, projected onto the body in general, and specifically onto the butt. And, throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century, that autopsy report was cited as evidence for, racist ideas and ideas about, sex workers and hypersexuality and race. And in some ways, it's still with us, even if people aren't actually citing that specific autopsy report.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought there. And it's also, it's equally horrific to know that it wasn't just this one scientist who was trying to prove this by studying black butts and I guess exotic or foreign butts. But there was a general scientific obsession in this regards to try and prove an idea or ideas that certain races are above or below others, specifically based on the size of butts.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, and sort of off, it's an awful story. In the 19th century, the idea of race itself is being created, and this was a project that goes back to at least 2 centuries previously. And for we think of race as about skin color, but by the 19th century, these like so-called racial scientists are using other parts of bodies to determine racial hierarchy. Kind of famously, a thing a lot of people have heard about is the use of head shape. Stephen Jay Gould wrote a lot about this in the 80s and 90s, and his work is actually one of the reasons that the story of Sarah Baartman became more well known. But also, the size of noses, which maybe makes some sense with racial stereotypes. There's also the size of butts and the shape of butts. I mean, it's even like there's these books you can read where they talk about like toe length and as a marker of beauty. So they become kind of obsessed and interested in these other kinds of bodily features as markers of race. And they're trying to create racial hierarchies, but because race is kind of in a sense not real, they're trying to find these things that they can sort of hold on to make it real. And of course, any racial project like this, they're creating stereotypes about Black people, and they're creating stereotypes about white people that are always in juxtaposition for this. So, the big butted hypersexual Black woman is the stereotype that Cuvier is creating, and many other scientists are citing and reifying. But also this sort of sexually innocent, pure white woman is also being created in juxtaposition from this. So it's all kind of goes hand in hand, and it's like a big and complex story of 19th century race science that, there's lots of great books on it if people are interested in finding out more. There's one, my favorite is called The History of White People by Nell Painter.
Despite some of these awful ideas, those pure white women of the 1800s decided to make the bustle a popular thing. What exactly is this for somebody who's unfamiliar, and why would something that is such a colossal inconvenience become so popular?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, that second question you could ask about just about any undergarment that became popular in the 19th century. But the bustle is basically like a big fake butt that women strapped onto their bodies. At the end, it was really popular in the 1870s and 80s. And, it was made of steel or springs or, kind of like pads, kind of like lobed pads. Or some women just stuffed newspaper into like a pillowcase and pinned that to them. So it took all kinds, and it was really popular across classes, and it was like the fashion. And there's a lot of reasons for why this might have been. One of the many theories is that the bustle made your waist look thinner. Another one is that in the mid 19th century there was this really big fad of the like huge petticoats, so like those big hoop skirts you see in like kind of like Civil War era iconography. And they were so big that women couldn't actually walk through doors. So the bustle kind of is a way that they can still have this like big skirt, but they can actually walk through the door. So those are a couple of the dominant theories. But then there's also a theory that you see throughout, kind of like, it's almost like a historical rumor you see in different parts of the historical record, that the bustle is in part inspired by the body of Sarah Baartman. And I was really interested in this because it felt like a pretty old echo of something that we see today, which is a kind of mode of cultural appropriation. And the idea is that, whether women kind of consciously knew it or not, that wearing this particular kind of silhouette was, it looked a lot like pretty famous images of Sarah Baartman's silhouette that were, people would have seen throughout the 19th century in a variety of different places. So it was like one of the questions I was asking. And I think that the bustle can kind of also offer us a kind of a way of thinking about cultural appropriation, because of this kind of move you can imagine these women making, which is like they literally are putting on this big fake butt that looks like Sarah Baartman's butt, and then they're taking it off. And both of those gestures of putting on and taking off, I think, tell us something about what cultural appropriation is about, which is this kind of playing around in Blackness, in stereotypes of Black women, and be discarding it when you're done with it, when it's no longer suits you. So I'm sure we'll get to it, but this was something I definitely saw in the work I did about the last 20 years. I think Miley Cyrus is kind of the ultimate example of it in the last, 20 years.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Before that, though, who was Gordon Conway, and how did he help reshape fashion and feminism with regards to the butt in the early 1900s?
Actually, Gordon Conway's a lady, and she's
Oh, my apologies.
her archives are right in Austin, and I think there's the woman who did most of the work about it. She lives in Austin. So Gordon Conway was a illustrator in the 19 teens and 20s, and she helped to bring in the image of the flapper. So she kind of helped to redefine what femininity was going to look like in the 20th century. Before Gordon Conway and a few other kind of big illustrators helped to create this new image. It was the Gibson girl and like this kind of, the bustle, the corset, these types of femininity of this sort of super curvy woman were the body ideals. And they were shaped through, bustles, corsets, these kind of undergarments that actually shaped, created a new body underneath a dress. And by the 1920s, this has started to change. And the flapper, which I think is an image that most people have some familiarity with, it's like a super straight-bodied, corsetless woman who doesn't have a lot of curves, is often quite thin. People call them the rectangle woman. This becomes the kind of dominant body ideal. And there's an association of the flapper with ideas of freedom and liberation. And there's a lot of historical reasons for that. But I think it's also important to point out that there's a very famous fashion historian named Valerie Steele who's really questioned that idea, that we think you're freed from the corset and like all of a sudden, life is great. You don't have to have all these crazy contraptions on yourself. But in the 1920s is also the time when we start to see fad diets and bathroom scales and plastic surgery all are kind of invented during this period of time. And women are, the idea is basically instead of having a corset on the outside of the body, it comes inside the body, and women have to kind of control themselves so that they're eating less and, exercising to some extent and managing their bodies themselves.
That's right. You wrote that the flapper look of the 1920s demanded masochistic self-control or even self-harm. You just mentioned that plastic surgery was really becoming a thing around this time, considering some of the horrific results of plastic surgery in modern times, with it having a chance to evolve over the last 100 years. I'm guessing that some of the worst cases of plastic surgery gone bad were horrific, if not costing individuals their lives at times.
Yeah, I tried to find out more about this. I never quite did. I always kind of wanted to spend a little more time on it. But the history of plastic surgery is super interesting. And, the 1920s, like just surgery of any kind is pretty new. Like general anesthesia is pretty new at that point. So, and actually in Chicago, that is where some of the work that I found out about was being done. And yeah, I mean, all I can say is like, I can only imagine that you're right, that it was not a great time to be having plastic surgery. And you must have really wanted your body to be different, like quite badly, to have to, voluntarily have surgery in that period. So I think that just tells us something about how potent these ideas about body ideals can be,
For those who are listening right now, wondering if social media was the beginning of people making histrionic claims as to society coming to an end for one reason or another, that's not the case, as is evidenced by Josephine Baker. How did her butt elicit the claim by some that European civilization was finished?
Well, Josephine Baker is such an interesting person and character. And, some people said she had the most famous butt of the 1920s. And she went to Paris in the early 20s. She had been a kind of chorus girl in New York and went to Paris, and she did this performance that was we actually don't know exactly what the performance was like because there was no video taken, but so you have to kind of piece together these different descriptions of it. But she was either naked or kind of nearly naked, and she shimmied around. She like did some butt forward dancing, and in Paris it caused this like massive sensation. People were horrified. It sort of is like the way people describe like Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. People were like fainting in the theater. It's just like this big ordeal because she, shook her butt on stage. And, there's a lot of complicated reads of Josephine Baker. Some people think she was self-exoticizing, that she was like she was sort of performing a stereotype of Black femininity, and that wasn't a good thing to have done. I mean, other people see that there's a lot of agency in that performance. I mean, I think at the time she was the wealthiest performer in the world. I could be wrong. I should fact check that, but she was definitely made a lot of money from her performances and had a lot of choice in what she was doing. And she basically was bringing the Charleston to Paris, which was, as many people know, it's like the expat, like roaring 20s center of the world in a lot of ways. So it's a super interesting moment in the history of the butt.
Shortly after this period, certain individuals started becoming obsessed with the idea of what is normal, and that includes what looks like normal. And this is exemplified very well by you in this book with somebody by the name of Norma. Who exactly is Norma?
Yeah, so Norma was, well, she's not really a real person so much as a statue. And she had a friend. His name was Norm Mann. And the idea here was that these two people, a gynecologist and a sculptor, fun combo of people, I guess, they decided to get together and create these statues that would show people what normal looked like. And it was the late 1930s. This was kind of, in many ways, the height, even kind of the end of the height of the eugenicist era in the United States. Basically, almost every famous person and every major university was really invested in eugenics as an idea. And these two men were eugenicists. And what they were trying to show was, if your body looks like this, you should try to have more babies, basically. Like, you're the right kind of person to procreate. And it's interesting because they're selling the idea of normal, which is like, I think for maybe today, I'd have to sort of think about this, but I think to some people, like, they're like, well, who wants to be normal? You want to be exceptional. You want to be amazing, but they're sort of saying normal is the best thing you can possibly be. And that's how these, that's what they're trying to sell essentially with these statues, which were put up in the American Museum of Natural History here in New York. And then they eventually traveled to Cleveland, and where they got the data for, what they thought they were doing is they were creating like the average American person. So they took data from, for Norman, they used data from the Army. And then for Norma, they used this really interesting data set that was collected to create a schema for women's clothing sizes. But in both cases, you really see the dominance of the idea of the sort of thin, white, strong, able-bodied person. And that's clearly what they're trying to sell.
And they proved the fleeting nature of their own ridiculous idea by actually holding a contest to find the woman that actually fit the Norma criteria. And despite the fact that they went through literally thousands of applications and even had a group of finalists, they could never find that person who fit those exact specs.
Yeah, it's kind of wild, right? It's it's just sort of perfect in a way that they held this contest in Cleveland. Thousands of women sent in their measurements. None of them fit. None of them were normal. None of them are perfectly normal. So they gave the prize to the woman who came the closest. And to some extent, it proves their point too, which is like, to be perfectly normal is to be incredibly exceptional. But it also shows us how the thing that they were suggesting we should all try to be is an impossible ideal. Like, all ideals are impossible.
Exactly. As you just mentioned, the sizing of clothing is far from an exact science. You did some fascinating research on how clothing companies create sizes, and there really is no rhyme or reason. One company's large can be another company's medium. As it pertains to women's clothing, though, and specifically women's pants and skirts, who exactly is Natasha Wagner, and why is she the standard by which many companies judge how their pants and bottoms fit in the backside?
Yeah, so Natasha, who's a nice, wonderful person. I always feel like I need to say that because I feel like in the course of doing publicity for the book, I've made Natasha into like a minor celebrity, maybe. And it's not her fault that what I'm about to say. It's just she has a cool job, which is she's a fit model, and that what that means is that her body, her like lower body mostly, because she's a fit model mostly for pants, is the only body that most clothing companies use to fit their clothes. So the way it works now is that Natasha comes in and they try on a pair of pants and they make them fit her, and she comes in a few different times. They try a few different prototypes until it fits exactly right. She gives them she says you need stronger belt loops so I can pull it up or whatever. She gives them tips, and then that's it. That's the only time they actually try the pants on a human woman. Other than that, every other size is they use a mathematical equation to make it bigger or smaller. And, if you're not Natasha, your pants probably are not going to fit that well. You might be lucky, but probably not. And the data that they use, the way that they do this, it's often a trade secret. The data that they, it's based on some kind of data. It's not like totally arbitrary, but I think the idea here is that it's basically impossible to make clothes that are going to fit the wide range of human women. And the clothing companies know that, and they're, in some sense they're doing the best they can, but it's just kind of not really a thing that's ever going to work if we're going to mass produce clothes. So, I mean, a thing now, the kind of quintessential moment, I think, of thinking about this is being in the dressing room and trying on clothes. And for years, I thought like, I thought like my butt's too big. Like there's something wrong with my body. And that's why these pants never fit me. But after talking to Natasha and kind of understanding more about how size works, I realized that it's actually like, it's not even just that there's something wrong with pants or these pants that I'm trying on. It's actually that there's something wrong with like pants in general or clothes in general, like that it's an industrial product that we're trying to fit onto our bodies, which are by their nature so specific.
Yeah, very well put there. I love that this biography of the butt and the female butt does include the jazzercise era of the 1980s. Not only did you discuss Jane Fonda's importance in this space and really the popularization of it all, but you also document the rise of Buns of Steel, which anybody growing up in the 1980s has to remember that VHS tape, or those VHS tapes, I guess. You even went to great lengths to track down Greg Smythe, the creator of Buns of Steel. So what did you learn from taking a deep dive into the creation and popularization of Buns of Steel?
Well, Greg Smythe's a real character. And, it was a man of his time. He was a champion pole vaulter in college, and he was a man with a dream. He wanted to be a famous aerobics instructor. And it was at a time when that was definitely a thing. Like Jane Fonda had, created these aerobics videotapes that were massively popular. It was like the reason why the VHS player became, was in all of our homes when we were growing up in the 80s and 90s. And aerobics had become this massively popular way to spend time, which I think is super interesting just on its own, because it was a way that women could basically participate in exercise, which was really new in the 70s and 80s. Title IX had just passed. And before that, really women did not do sports by and large, or if they did do sports, it was very suspect in a number of ways. So Greg Smythe in the mid 80s, he kind of jumps on this trend, and he was teaching up in Anchorage, Alaska, and he had this butt workout that was really popular. And one of his students came up with this name, Buns of Steel. And it took a long time for him to sell it. He was really broke, and he owed all this money to like his landlord. And but eventually he found somebody to sell it, and it made a lot of money. And as he said, he made millions of dollars based on just that little phrase, Buns of Steel. And eventually a woman named Tammy Webb became the actual Buns of Steel, because although Greg Smithy did he was the star of the first video, they realized they actually wanted, in order that the people who did aerobics were women, and they needed a woman to be the face and butt of the franchise. So yeah, Buns of Steel was super, super popular. But I think like a thing we can sort of start to think about aerobics and Buns of Steel is the like what it was really selling. And a part of what it was selling was this idea that we're in control of our bodies. And it was at a time when being in control of yourself was really seen as a super important thing, because of the new ideas about neoliberalism and the kind of end of the New Deal era. And it can sound kind of grand to be like, oh, it's about neoliberalism, I think, but I think it kind of was like, it's like doing these kind of like, basically being in control of your body through fitness was a way to say, I am like literally like a self-made body. I am a self-made person. I can do these exercises, and I can, create the body that that I'm supposed to have. And for people who couldn't do that for any number of reasons, it was actually, it could be a very painful kind of mandate to have to live with.
Yeah, Deb Burgard is another interesting example that's kind of a subset of this ideology. Who exactly was she, and why was she important in the story that you were telling?
Yeah, Deb Burgard was kind of at the helm of a activist movement in the Bay Area in the 1980s that they called fat fitness, where, self-identified fat women mostly were, they created aerobics classes for fat people. And I talked to her and to this other woman, Rosella Canty-Lettsome, and they had these kind of amazing classes for women who didn't feel like they could participate in aerobics culture because they were too large, but who still wanted to move their bodies around and enjoy the liberation that exercise can offer to all of us. And I think for them, and talking to them, I found it very inspiring, and kind of it kind of offered a way, like a corrective to what I was seeing over and over again in this research, which was just like, modes of control and body ideals emerging out of these kind of intense historical moments about race and gender. I mean, obviously this was another intense historical moment about race and gender, but here were people who were trying to find liberation despite the control, and they really did. And they're, fascinating people who still, those two women are still, they're still exercising, they're still feeling great about their bodies, they're still finding ways to think in interesting ways about power, liberation, and fitness.
Yeah, one of the elements that I found fascinating about this is that Deb insisted on using words like large and fat in place of obese and overweight. What was the rationale here?
I think it was sort of a reclamation. It's like, gay people reclaiming the word queer, which had been a slur for a long time. I think it was a way of saying, yeah, we're fat. Like, that's okay with us. Like, why can't it be okay with you? Yeah. And and they called it fat fitness then. And certainly now that is a very common thing that, there's a lot of like fat activism, and like you see this on social media a lot. It's the reclamation of that word fat, but this was quite a long time ago, and they were kind of on the forefront of doing that type of activist work.
Yeah, really interesting for sure. Well, I have to admit, Heather, when I first read about this book, the Sir Mix-a-Lot song, Baby Got Back, it popped into my head, and I've thought about how to promote our eventual conversation, and Sir Mix-a-Lot continues to come to my mind, as does Buns of Steel, by the way. But how much of a parody did Mix initially intend that song to be?
I mean, I think Mix knows it's funny, and, knows to some extent understands why people think it's a fun song, but he didn't think it was a parody. He really was a man with a message, and it's not disguised what his message was. It's right there in all the lyrics. He wants, he was seeing that his girlfriend at the time, who was a big butted woman of color, she was a model and she wasn't getting modeling gigs. She thought because she didn't have, what I think he calls it the stop sign body, which was, big boobs, super thin, kind of big hair, kind of like almost like a 1980s beauty ideal. because she had a big.
We call that the Dallas, Texas look down here.
Yeah, well, I guess that's how I'm imagining it. It's this like big blonde hair. And so his girlfriend thought it was because she had a big butt, and Mix was like, but I love women with big butts, like what's going on? And so he writes this song kind of celebrating what he sees as black, maybe like what black men thought was sexy. That's basically, I think, what he thought it was. And he saw it as a corrective to a super white idea of what was beautiful and what was sexy. And, he says all of that in the song really straightforwardly. And we take it as a parody, or as at the very least, as a big joke or something funny. I think mostly because he says the word butt so many times, and we just can't, for lots of reasons that we can talk about if you want. I think the word butt, just people think it's really funny, and they, in a way, they don't take him totally seriously. Although honestly, of all the things, like, I think Mix really got what he wanted. It's not like we live in a pretty, or like, at least we sort of have been living in a very sexual, like a world where the big butt is sexualized, but the woman with the big butt still needs to be thin. It's sort of like there's still a stop sign kind of happening there. It's just a different set of, like, a different part of the body that's being sexualized.
It was a nice counter also to that heroin chic era of the 1990s, which was really a return to the flapper mindset, I guess. And by the way, the original definition of flapper was either underage sex worker in England, or an underage girl whose body hadn't developed just yet. So you had this movement in the 1990s where it was trying to make, I hate to say underdeveloped, because everybody has their own body, but a body that almost looked more like a teenage boy's body than a young woman's body. And Sir Mix-a-Lot comes along to say, actually, the opposite is true here. This is the best looking body. But I think it also speaks to this notion that everybody has different interests, and everybody has a different body type too. And we need to find a way to try and embrace them all if possible.
Yeah. And I think that's such a good point. And I think sometimes it gets like, it's something I need to make sure I say more, is like, there's nothing wrong with having a body that's super thin or kind of androgynous. Like, I certainly wanted that kind of body when I was in the early 90s, but it's not that we should be celebrating any one body over any other body. Like, people have all kinds of bodies, and they're all great. There's generally, like, we're all, we find people who find us attractive. We have relationships if you want them. Like, there's really nothing wrong with any particular body. It's that there's these cultural pressures that make it so that one body is considered better than another kind of body. And it was one of the things I wanted to explore right from the beginning of this book, is just like the bizarre, odd thing that is like a body type coming in and out of fashion, because it's not something that we can actually change that much about ourselves. So, it's great that Mix was celebrating the big butted woman, but at the same time, like, I mean, there's much that's wrong with that song too. There's quite a lot of misogyny in it, but there's also the thing where it's like, he's still saying there's one kind of body that's better than all the other kinds of bodies. It's not exactly like a body positive anthem. It's just a big butt anthem.
Just an expression of what he loves.
Yeah.
Why have women's butts become so much more openly discussed since around the turn of the century, Heather?
I mean, it's such a good question. I think there's a lot of factors at play. So there's this kind of important moment. So in the early 90s, we get Sir Mix-a-Lot. There's sort of like the rise of hip hop, particularly hip hop songs about big butted women, or about big butts. And then there's this moment in 1997 that butt scholars, which that is a thing, talk about. It's when Jennifer Lopez is in this movie called Out of Sight, and she does all this press for it. And she'd been in Selena, she had been a dancer on In Living Color. She was a rising celebrity, but this was definitely like a crossover moment from Latina and hip hop culture into mainstream white culture. And all of a sudden, every magazine that interviews her is asking her about her butt in this way that's like really weird and funny, and also just truly bizarre, which is like, they're just like, what's up with your butt? Which is not a very good interview question because it's really hard to answer. I wouldn't know what anyone could say about that.
Way too open-ended, no pun intended there.
It's like, well, what do you mean? And I think when I started to really, I had read about this, and then I looked for all these magazines that were doing this. And one of the things that's interesting about it is before that moment, they didn't even say the word butt. They used these kind of even weirder euphemisms like derriere or backside. And all of the articles had been about like how to get rid of your butt. And then all of a sudden after the Jennifer Lopez moment, there's articles about how men like, like, is the booty the new boobs or whatever. And here's how you get a bigger butt. Like things really started to change a little bit. And the reason, there's lots of reasons this might be. The two that I've found and like that a lot of scholars cite is the rise of hip hop as a mainstream form of music. By the early 2000s, most people say that hip hop is the dominant form of American music. And in hip hop videos, at the 90s, we have to remember that most people kind of experience music through MTV. And so it wasn't just an oral medium, it was a visual medium. And a lot of hip hop videos were, like Baby Got Back, were showing women with big butts. And so this kind of becomes a mainstream beauty ideal because one of the biggest demographics for hip hop music is actually white men. So this kind of mainstreaming of what was at one time kind of a marginal or a racialized idea of beauty is starting to happen by the end of the 90s. And also the demographics of America are changing pretty significantly in that decade. But it's not really until a decade later with Kim Kardashian that we get this like kind of massive rise of the big butt as a beauty ideal. And that is really in part because of social media and the way that Instagram kind of brought into its algorithm the butt as this kind of in some ways it was like the dirtiest thing you could put on Instagram in the early days. And then it kind of, it was like a snake eating its tail. It just could like keep going and going and going.
We may talk a little bit more about my fellow Armenian Kim Kardashian here in just a second. I did want to ask you one more question about that turn of the century era, which did include the very popular song Bootylicious by Destiny's Child. For the past 20 years, scholars and journalists have debated as to whether or not Beyonce is feminist. And if so, what kind of feminist is she? So I ask you, is she a feminist? And if so, what kind?
I mean, I wouldn't even begin to, that's sort of, I feel like slightly out of my jurisdiction. I think that Beyonce has done a lot, and it's, she's to some extent, maybe the more interesting question is she a feminist is like, how has she participated in feminism and what has she done for how women think about their bodies? I mean, I think the song Bootylicious, it's really different than Baby Got Back, right? Like it's a woman talking about her own body. And there's lots to be criticized about the video, about the way that she's, presents herself. Like there's lots we can sort of think about and complicate. But I think for a lot of women, that song meant a lot to them. And it was a way of her kind of reclaiming something for herself. I mean, what she says that song is about is, she was being called fat in the tabloids because although there was this interest in the butts in the late 90s and early aughts are like also this like extreme time of tabloid kind of cruelty where women are being harassed, celebrities are being harassed for, gaining a couple of pounds. And the tabloids are just, kind of at their peak. Also, Photoshop is coming in, and that like what is even possible, like, all of a sudden it's not just like what your body actually looks like, it's what they can do to you in Photoshop. So the super skinny beauty ideal is kind of like evolving right next to this new thing that's going to become more popular in the 2010s of, a little bit more curve and big buttedness. And in fact, some of the reason why it becomes so popular in the 2010s is because in the 2000s, the super, super thin woman is very popular as a beauty ideal. So Beyonce is in that song is kind of reacting to some of this criticism that she was getting in the press and saying, this isn't bad, it's actually good. And it's, when you look at a picture of Beyonce in 2002 or whenever that song came out, it's just like this is who they thought was fat. This is totally bananas. So, whether or not she's a feminist, I think it's the question. I do think she was trying to do something that's interesting, and she did advance the cause of, thinking in new and expanded ways about bodies. And I think for a lot of women, that song was super meaningful.
All right. So why was 2014 considered to be the year of the butt, Heather?
Well, this was something that, I think the New York Times, Vogue magazine, they all declared it to be such. And it's coming off of, about 5 years of Kim Kardashian growing in popularity. That very famous magazine cover of her where she's, shown in silhouette with the champagne going over her head and landing on her butt comes out that year. And it's on the heels of this Miley Cyrus performance at the VMAs where she twerks. And so it's just this kind of, apex moment, although in some ways it kept going after that. It's just that's when they started talking about it more, of this interest in big butts as a part of mainstream white culture. So yeah, and it was also, the Brazilian butt lift was more popular than it had ever been that year, although it got more popular. Well, those stats are a little complicated, but it continued to rise in popularity after that a little bit. And this ideal just really felt like it was everywhere that year.
Was the Brazilian butt lift exactly what it sounds like?
The Brazilian butt lift it's a plastic surgery procedure where they liposucked. I'm still like, my copy editor and I went back and forth. Is like liposucked a word out fat out of your stomach, and they inject it into your butt. So they are not just making your butt bigger, but they're actually making your middle smaller. And it's a pretty dangerous plastic surgery procedure because if it's not done right, there can be a embolism that can, kill you actually. And it can be quite dangerous if it's not done well. And in the 90s, it was basically not even a thing in the US. And then by the mid 2010s, it was one of the most popular cosmetic surgery procedures in America.
Still doing those masochistic things all these years later. All right, final question now, Heather. For somebody who has spent the last half decade researching and writing this excellent book, it's one of my favorite books of 2022. I can't wait to release the conversation in early 2023. What is the next big thing for women's butts?
Oh, man. Well, there's this thing going on right now that I'm getting asked a lot about, that maybe Kim Kardashian took out or whatever she did. She had is reversing her Brazilian butt lift. Maybe thin is in, maybe that the thin ideal is coming back. The truth is, who knows? Probably because of the way fashion works, because big butts have been in fashion for so long, they will certainly go out of fashion. And, I think it's important to question even what it meant that they were in fashion, because it was never all butts are okay now or all big butts are okay now. It always had to be on this very thin woman, kind of like the Sir Mix-a-Lot ideal. It wasn't Deb Burgard's ideal. It was definitely much more like Sir Mix-a-Lot's ideal. And so I assume that will sort of be part of it. But what I hope would happen is that there would be, a continuation in the interest in body positivity, which also, did kind of get more popular as social media got bigger in the 2010s. But I don't think it's probably very likely, because the history of bodies and the history of butts is a history of, people trying to control what bodies mean and what butts mean. And I think probably we'll just see some new version of that moving forward.
She is Heather Radke. She did an awesome job of really diving into the history of the butt and Butts, a backstory. You can get it now wherever books are sold. Heather, thank you so much for the time today, and thank you for this wonderful book.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks to Gentleman Jesus for the intro and outro music. Hear more of his work at gentlemanjesus.com. And thanks to you for tuning in. For more of the show and to connect on social media, visit booksonpod.com. Talk to you next time on Books on Pod.